Well, there are some people are cat people and some people are dog people. So how many dog people we have in the room? All right, I'm a dog person. Okay, we'll put her in. How many cat people in the room? Right now we know who to stay away from. Okay. Then they say there's mountain people and there's beach people. How many people choose the beach over the mountain? All right, how many choose the mountain over the beach? How many like to go to both? Yay, that's me. I like both of those. What about how many you choose cake over pie? How many cake people we got? We got cake people. How many pie people? Who want to go with pie? I'm going to go with pie, about half there. All right, so here's how many Coke people we got in the room? We got any Coke people in the room? I'm a Coke person. All right, how many Pepsi people we got in the room? Wow. Y'all can repent. If you're over 40 years old, you realize that Coke didn't always used to be classic Coke. There used to just be Coke. When I was in high school, there was just Coke. And then Coke had this thing that came out in the early 80s, and they were going to change the formula. And so they called it New Coke. Tasted a lot like Pepsi to me. And I remember a short time after that, they brought back the classic Coke. They brought back the original formula, and they called it Classic Coke. And even today, when you hold up a Coke can, it has Classic Coke on it. And a lot of people just, those arguments back in the day was that a publicity stunt? What was on that? But there's something about the word classic. And then when you see the word classic, I mean, we like new and we like those kinds of things, but we also like classic. I mean, a lot of times, even in the stores that we go in now, you have something that's brand new, but it's made to look what? Old. It's made to look classic. We like classic. Lisa and I, part of our vacation, we spent some time in New York City, and we went to see some Broadway shows. And the first one that we went to, the first one that we chose, the first one that we're going to go to is one we knew. We knew regardless of what was going on. We knew it was safe. We knew it would be fun. We knew all kind of things, and we went to see Cinderella. Because this is a classic story. Now, over the 4 shows we saw, Cinderella was the least favorite. Because the other ones were really good. But part of the reason it was the least favorite is because we knew the story. There were no surprises. I mean, there was a little twist, but it was just a very little twist. But we knew the story. We'd seen Cinderella so many times. We knew exactly what was going to happen. We knew the characters. The other shows, we had no idea. We didn't know the story. We didn't know where it was going. We didn't know anything. So that helped us be a little bit more engaged. We're in a series that we're calling Courage, where we're looking at courage. This idea that in order to do tough things, in order to do hard things, in order to say difficult things, that we need to have courage. And that for a lot of us, a lot of times in our lives, courage is missing because it's just easier not to be courageous. It's easier not to do the hard things. And today we're looking at a classic story, and we've had it read to us this morning, the classic story of David and Goliath. And for most of us, when we hear David and Goliath, we almost immediately check out. And the reason that we check out is because why? We know the story, and we've heard it a million times, and geez, how many more things can we say about the story of David and Goliath? Now, for some of you, it may be a new story. Maybe you've never heard of it. I met a person one time that thought David and Goliath was a sports metaphor. They thought everything was just about the underdog going, and they had no idea there was an actual story of David and Goliath that happened in the Old Testament. And we've looked at this story, and we've had the story read to us this morning. And David, the story of David is a big, massive story. And it doesn't begin with the story of David and Goliath, but it's at the very beginning of David's story. And there's some things that we can learn about courage as we look at this classic story of David and Goliath. And David had the courage to face some things. And it's 4 things that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to start with the most obvious. I'm going to start with what usually is the climax. I'm going to start at the end of the story. The first thing that I want us to talk about this morning, where we see where David was able to have courage, and what he faced a giant. And when you read the scriptures, we have all of these accounts of how big Goliath was and how much his sword weighed and all of this kind of stuff. And when we think of David and Goliath, we think of that story, that's generally what we think about. We think about David, or maybe the picture comes to mind, and we got the big Philistine standing there, and the little shepherd boy standing there with his slingshot like this. And it is a big part of the story, and it is very intimidating to us to think about going up against someone that is so much bigger than us. And then when we hear the story read, or we read it slowly, we realize that the pictures that a lot of us saw as kids with Goliath there and David, that's not a true picture, because when you read the scripture, you realize that Goliath had somebody with him. He had a shield bearer with him. So David wasn't just going up against Goliath, he was going up against two people. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called David and Goliath, and he starts off the book, and he'd done lots of research with Israeli intelligence and all kinds of things, and brought out some things about David facing Goliath that I think is worth hearing. First of all, Goliath was so big, probably had some type of disorder that Goliath had to make him be so big. And one of the primary things that happens when someone has this disorder where their body just keeps growing is that it really messes with their eyesight. And when you read the story and you read it slow, you notice some things. Well, one of the things that we notice is that he has a shield bearer. Now, if you're 9 feet tall and your spear weighs 120 pounds, do you really need a little buddy to go with you? Not unless you can't see. And then you need somebody to walk you down to the front. Because when we read it and David shows up, Goliath even says, "Come to me so that I can see you." So David just doesn't walk right up in front of him. And I've been a little guy all my life. And this is how my deal is. I want to try to be smarter than you. And the second thing is, I'm going to be quicker than you. So you may be able to beat me up, but you're going to have to catch me first. And this is the way David approaches this. David goes in and says, "You're going to have to catch me. I'm not going to just walk up to where you can see." So Goliath probably couldn't see very well. Now here's the most interesting thing about David. David took a slingshot. Now when you and I, or at least when I think of slingshot, I think the kind you buy at Walmart and you pull back and you shoot and it just, it doesn't make it to the sign. But if you study military history and you study the slingshot and how it was used and the force that it could deliver, it was a deadly, deadly weapon. In fact, whole sections of certain militaries would be slingshotters because they were deadly with the slingshot. They've done some studies about these, now that we can do these kind of things, of measuring the rock and how fast it goes and the force that it goes. And that with those slingshot, you can create the equivalent of a handgun, especially at a close distance. If you're within 10 to 20 yards of someone, it'd be the same as having a gun. So do you know what David did? David took a gun to a knife fight. He did. You know what Goliath did? He took a knife to a gunfight. And you know who wins that fight every time? Yeah, the guy with the gun. The guy with the gun always wins. So here's something that we need to understand. If I'm going to have courage, courage is much more possible when I'm smart. Do you know this? So a lot of times when we hear the classic story of David, because David and Goliath, we only remember the high part. So we think David shows up, and we have him pictured in our mind that he's 12, and he shows up with a little lunch for his brother, and he's this little feeble boy, and he goes down because God supernaturally comes down on top of him and gives him the courage to go out and fight Goliath. Now God plays a role in this, and we'll get to that towards the end. But David was smart. When you read the story of David, that we've read this morning, at any point in this story, do you sense that David is fearful? No. Nowhere in this story is he afraid. Nowhere in the story does he lack confidence. See, if I'm going to have courage, if I'm going to be courageous, it certainly helps if I'm smart. It certainly helps if there's a knife fight going on, I'm going to take a gun. Courage helps us to be courage when we're smarter. Now, David not only fought a giant, but because before he got to the giant, he had to fight somebody else. You know who he had to fight? He had to fight the king. Because when you go in the story, David had to go to the king because the king's calling all of the people to come down and fight, and David's willing to do it. So David has to go before the king. So David goes before King Saul, goes into his tent, and he says, I'm going to go take out this godless Philistine. And Saul doesn't want to let him do it. Eventually, Saul lets him do it. And if you're familiar with the story, and if you paid attention when we read it, what does Saul do? He gives him armor. Whose armor does he give? Okay, can we take a time out? Whose armor did King Saul give to David? His armor is the right answer, okay? So I'm going to count to 3. Everybody go, his armor. 1, 2, 3. He didn't give him some armor. He didn't give other soldiers armor. He gave David whose armor? His armor. So what is Saul telling David to do? He's giving him permission to go fight Goliath, and he's saying, do it the way I would do it. Now, I don't have the guts to go do it, David. But if I did, this is how I would do it. So here's my stuff. So fight this battle the way I would fight this battle. Now, out of respect to the king, you know what David does? He puts it on. And then he says something very interesting. He says, I cannot wear this. And in the New American Standard Version, it says this. The word is, because I have not tested it. I have not tested it. See, David knew who he was. He knew what he had in a slingshot. He knew how to fight the giant Philistine who could not see. He didn't need the king's armor. Now, how much courage does it take to walk into the king's tent and tell the king, I don't need your stuff? How much courage does it take to look at the king and say, your way is not the best way? A lot. This is an enormous amount of courage that David is having to do. And here's what courage, this is what we know. Courage is possible when I know myself. See, courage is possible when I'm smarter and I train myself and I get intelligent. But courage also becomes possible when I know myself, when I know what I am capable of doing, when I know what I have tested. At any point, somebody needs something done at a very high height, like over 3 feet. I get somebody else to do it because I know myself. Because I can't do it. I freeze up. So David knew, I can't put on all of this armor. I can't fight with a sword. It's better. I know who I am. I know how I'm put together. I know where I'm gifted. And by the way, I would just rather take the gun to the knife fight than a knife to the knife fight. Courage is much more possible when I know myself. David had to fight the giant. It took a lot of courage to fight the giant. He also had to go up against the king, and it takes a lot of courage to do that. Another thing that David had to go up against was the crowd. When David shows up, and I don't know if you pay, in the scripture it tells us that David was going back and forth. There's a little bit of shepherd, a little bit hanging out at the war zone, a little bit of shepherd going back and forth. And when he arrives, and the Philistine had been doing this, and Goliath had been mocking the nation of Israel, and he'd been doing all of this stuff. King Saul was asking for somebody to go fight them, and nobody stood up. You know how when you go to the airport and you're waiting on the flight, and they come on the thing and said this flight is overbooked, and if somebody would like to go at a later flight, then we'll give you 2 free Cokes, and nobody moves. Okay, then a little bit later they come on and say, well, we're going to give a $150 coupon, and nobody moves. And then they get to that, okay, we've really oversold this flight, and we need 2 people to give up, and with that, it's a $500 coupon to each person, and everybody jumps up and runs over. Because the reward, as the reward goes up, the more you think about, oh, okay, I could be 4 hours late. You know what the reward here was? If he went and took out Goliath, the reward was this. You got to marry one of the king's daughters. You know what that means? You up in the palace. That's what that means. You up in the palace. All right, this is a big deal. They eat better in the palace than they do in the tent. You know what else the reward was? No taxes for you or your family. This is a big reward. And guess how many people were in line to fight Goliath? Guess how many people were in line to fight Goliath? 0. Nobody. So David shows up and nobody's doing it. And he starts asking questions and nobody's doing it. The crowd has said what? No. The crowd has said, this is crazy. The crowd has says, we're staying right here. The crowd says, if you go do that, you're insane. The crowd said, you'll be a fool to do that. The crowd says, the crowd says, the crowd says, the crowd says. In order for David to accomplish what he accomplished by taking the head off of Goliath and giving victory to the nation of Israel, he had to face the crowd. And it takes an enormous amount of courage to face the crowd. Because you and I want to be accepted. You and I want to fit in. We don't want to stand out. And we'll go with the crowd all the time. But David had to have the courage to say, I'm not going to go to the crowd. Courage is possible when the crowd has no power. So courage is possible when I'm smarter. Courage is possible when I know myself. Courage is possible when the crowd has no power. But as long as the crowd has power, you're in trouble. And courage won't be there. The last thing that David had to face was this. His brother. Do you remember that part of the story? I mean, we really never ever talk about that part of the story. Again, we're talking about Goliath and slingshot, little boy, that whole part. We don't talk about the brother because David shows up and he's asking his questions. And then his older brother comes in and does what? He ridicules him. He says, what are you doing? He calls David out. And I don't know if you noticed, but David's response was, what have I done? Anybody? What have I done? What have I done? What have I done? Come on, what have I done? One more time. What have I done? So how many times do you think he's ticked off his brother? A lot. Let me tell you the thing that really ticked off his brother. Because in the chapter before David and Goliath, Samuel shows up to anoint the new king of Israel. And David's not even brought into the picture. He's left in the pasture with the sheep. And God tells Samuel, it's none of these brothers. It's none of these men. You got any other sons? He says, I do have one little scrawny one out that I didn't even bring in. You want me to go get him? Bring him in. He brought him in. God says, Samuel, this is him. And so right there in front of his older brothers, the youngest is anointed the what? The coming soon-to-be king of Israel. Now, who was watching that? Mr. Brother. Mr. Brother was watching that. And so when David shows up and starts asking questions, like, who is this Philistine? Why isn't anybody doing something about this? Now, did I mention that David was smart? Did I mention that? Do you know one of the other questions David asked? Did I mention that David was smart? Do you know one of the other questions that David asked? What do you get if you take him out? What's the reward? Looks like this guy's got a knife. I got a gun. What's the reward? That's confidence. That's smart. He knew it. He had to face his brother. He had to not pay attention to his brother. Now, you know this, and you didn't have to get up on church early on a Sunday morning and come to church to learn this. The hardest battles you'll ever deal with are in your family. And the people that will criticize you the most are in your family. And the place that jealousy is the most rampant is in your family. And the place that you need acceptance more than you need anywhere else is in your family. And the person that you need to tell you that they're proud of you more than anybody is your father. When you stand up to your family, you're courageous. And David stood up to his brother. He didn't let his brother talk him out of doing what David knew that he was supposed to do. See, courage is possible when I ignore the jealous and the critical. And I think these are four really key things. Courage is possible when I'm smarter. Courage is possible when I know who I am. Courage is possible when the crowd has no power. And courage is possible when I don't pay attention to the jealous and the critical. Now, one of the reasons a lot of times we go through life with no courage is because we don't train ourselves. We don't become lifelong learners. We're not trying to get smarter. We don't know ourselves. Or if we do know ourselves, we ignore ourselves. I listen to the crowd. And the jealous, critical person is the person who I pay the most attention to. And you put all of those things together and we live courageous-less life instead of a courageous life. And David had the courage to ignore the giant, to ignore the king, to ignore the crowd, and to ignore his brother. Now, David is an all-star. We know what all-stars are like. There's those people that come along every now and then that dominate everything, and you just can't. There's no comparison. You take the Jack Nicklaus of the golf world, or you take the Michael Jordan of the basketball world, or you take the best actor, or you take Bill Gates in the computer world. I mean, these guys are all-star, and for us, we're average. We're average, and nothing wrong with being average, by the way. Average is a great place to be. And they're superstars, and David's a superstar. I mean, he wrote most of Psalms. He was a king. He did all kinds of things. He made some really big mistakes. Even when David went big all the time. He went big on his mistakes. He went big on his victories. He was just that kind of guy. And most of us aren't like that. So what are some of the things that we can learn from this? I mean, we need to see the way that David went through those courage. But real quick, there's some things that we just need to, I think, that reminds us that there's some things that courage knows. Courage knows that obstacles will always exist. Okay? Obstacles will always exist. Something's always going to get in the way. Somebody's always going to get in the way. It's just obstacles are going to exist. We need to expect obstacles. We don't need to be surprised by them. We need to expect giants. We don't need to be surprised by them. So obstacles are going to always exist. The second one is this. Courage knows that I need to be the me God created me to be. I just simply can't be that. And out of all of the things that I see in this story of David, that is the thing that jumps out at me the most. I know he takes out Goliath. I know he deals with his brother. I know he deals with the crowd. But what he does in that tent in front of the king, when he says, no. because he knows who he is. And if I'm going to be courageous, I have to know who I am. I have to know what I'm good at. I have to know what I'm bad at. I have to know what my flaws are, and I got to build walls around those flaws. Can't put myself in situations where I'm going to fail. And in case you need some help with this, let me help you. If you have a drinking problem, don't go to a bar. You got a food problem, don't hang out in the potato chip aisle. You can't spend your money wisely, cut up all your credit cards. That's knowing yourself. And if I'm going to be courageous, I have to know myself. I have to understand that obstacles are going to happen, and I have to know, I have to be the person that God's created me to be. And then here's the ending. It all starts with trusting God. It all starts with trusting God. And I started with the giant on purpose. I didn't want to end with the giant. I started with the giant. Because by the time, this is what I believe in my heart, by the time David got to the giant, he was going, this is easy. There's nothing here. There's nothing here. Because he had trusted God in so many ways. And you know what? David had been trusting God for a long time. David didn't start trusting God when he showed up at the camp and had to deal with his brother. You imagine the nights, because when you go back, there's a couple of verses we can put up here at the end. He says, don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul, I'll go fight him. And another one is this: the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion, the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, he said, and may the Lord be with you. But he says, the Lord rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear. David had been trusting God for a long time. And you know when he trusted God before he trusted him with the lion and the bear as he's protecting his sheep? Can you imagine David's first night in the pasture when the sun goes down and you hear the lion and the bear? It's any wonder he wrote so many great psalms? Why did David get anointed by Saul? Samuel, why did God say here's the guy? Because David was a man after God's own heart. David had been trusting God his entire life. And here's the mistake we made. Maybe this is the one big takeaway for us this morning. Here's what we do. We wait till the giant shows up. And that's when we run to God. God, get me away from this giant. And in order to defeat the giant, you got to defeat the little things. Marriages don't fall apart over a weekend. Marriages don't fall apart over the weekend. They fall apart over a decade. Bad parenting, rebellious children don't happen over a weekend. They happen over a decade. Poor financial decisions is a pattern. And if I'm going to be able to have the courage to defeat the giants that are going to come along, I have to have been walking with God in the little things, in the daily things. And because when I walk with God in the little things, you know what it gives me? Courage. And the reason I have courage is because I have confidence. David walked out with a slingshot and took down Goliath, not because he was cocky, because he was confident. Because time after time after time after time, God had been faithful because he was faithful.